So please state your name.
My name is Peter Watts Jr.
All right. What do you do, Peter?
Currently, co-vocational, so I am pastor of a local church here in Los Angeles called the Rock Church that my wife and I started back in 2008. So it's been 13 years since we've started that church and still pastoring that church here in LA in the West Adams Pico Union neighborhood near USC in downtown. And then we have a nonprofit called the Watts of Power Foundation, which focuses on creating educational resources and opportunities for foster youth, first generation college students, and those living in high poverty zip codes.
Excellent, excellent. And how long have you and your wife been married?
We've been married for 27 years, been together for 29 years.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, we'll have to do a subsequent session just to talk to you and your wife about, having that's some love success right there.
Absolutely.
So let's get into one of the things that is crucial for a lot of relationships is the spiritual aspect. And that's whether you are tethered spiritually under the same faith or whether you have kind of the same viewpoints that can be merged. How important is it to have compatible spirituality?
I think having compatible spirituality is the foundation of a good, successful relationship and marriage. Doesn't mean that it will be the end all be all to answer all the challenges and questions that you may have in your marriage or relationship, but it's at least a base upon which to start. You have something to draw from, and you're drawing from that same well. And so for my wife and I, we're both Protestant Christians that have grown up in that particular faith, and in particular in the stream of the traditional Black Baptist Church, but currently are part of the Reformed Church in America denomination, which is a completely different kind of a denomination in which we had grown up in, but it's still Protestant Christian faith. And so that's the foundation for us. The Bible says don't be unequally yoked when talking about being in a relationship. And so we look at that as saying, being on the same page, and being on the same page starts with that spiritual foundation.
Very cool. And I was going to ask you about the whole concept of being unevenly yoked, because so many people invoke that phrase without really knowing what it means. I mean, I've even had people explain it using YOLK. But that's not what it is. Give me a little more detail. Where does the phrase come from, and a little bit more on the meaning?
Yeah, so the phrase comes from New Testament scripture. I believe it's the Apostle Paul that writes about being unequally yoked in the context of of relationships, or context of the local church and in ministry, being partners in ministry. And so because those were agrarian times, farming and things like that, they used a lot of donkeys and animals to till the land. And so these animals and things had these yokes around their necks. And those were, that was just part of the tools. And so the imagery of being unequally yoked, if you have these two animals that are working in unison with a yoke around their neck, and it's uneven, they're not going to be able to till that land. They're not going to be able to get that work done in an effective way. It's going to be hard. It's not going to work. But if they are equally yoked, the work becomes easier, and that yoke becomes less of a burden on either one of them. So you take that kind of imagery and illustration and concept into a relationship, talking about being unequally yoked. You're looking at being on the same page, working together, knowing that you're going to have some things that are on the shoulders of both the man and the woman, but being able to work in unison and on the same page makes that load a lot easier versus it feeling like one person is doing all the work and the other person is, and they're dragging the other person along.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. That man, that was beautiful. Because so many people think, for example, that if I am A&E and the woman is help me gospel or
Mm-hmm.
or COGIC,
Mm-hmm.
that we would then have difficulties simply because we have different denominations. Is that
Right.
necessarily or absolutely
No,
true?
no, not at all. Again, they're all part of the same kind of Protestant stream of faith. I would say it would be more of a challenge if they were part of two different religions. So if one was Muslim and the other was Christian, there would come a time where something about the way that they go about living out their faith would clash, and they would have to think through, what does that mean if we're going to live according to whatever these standards or our rules are according to our faith. How do we live that out if they are not matched or uneven, or someone is a believer and someone is not a believer? And so if you're going by the principles of what you believe in your faith and what's written in scripture versus somebody who doesn't have that as a plumb line for them, then you can run into issues as well.
Excellent, excellent. But that doesn't mean that they can't be worked through.
But it doesn't mean that they can't be worked. It's just going to be again, it's going to be really difficult because
Yeah,
there'll just be some major things that they will not know is an issue until that major thing becomes an issue, and then they have to figure out, well, how do we work this out?
that's
And if we're
right.
going to work it out, how do we work it out through the worldview of a Christian worldview or Islamic worldview or or a Buddhist worldview or a secular worldview?
Yes, yes. Okay, excellent. Now, in terms of two people who are equally yoked as far as their faith is concerned, what are some of the biggest challenges in terms of being, in a loving relationship, but but walking through the world, the regular world?
Yeah, I think the three biggest things when we do counseling, we tell people, especially young people who come to counseling, to premarital counseling, we tell them the three biggest monsters in a relationship and a marriage that you have to figure out is communication, sex, and money.
Hmm. Okay,
Can
break
you?
it down for each one of those.
So with communication, are you? They say that communication is the key. So are you really open in your communication, or do you hold things back because you don't want to upset the other person or make them feel bad, or whatever the case may be? So communication. What's the expectation around communication? Do you communicate enough to where you are transparent, to where they know everything about you, all of your joys and your pains and your secrets and the dark stuff that nobody else knows? Or are you still hiding some stuff from them? So communication. And then around sex, it's the intimacy. What is sex? What is sex in your relationship, in your marriage? What's been the history? What are you bringing? What baggage are you bringing to your relationship or marriage when it comes to sex? Did you grow up in a household where the whole idea of purity and not having sex before marriage, or you don't do this, or you only do missionary, or you don't, whatever the case may be, that versus somebody coming in and who's had a more sexual experience than the other person. They're coming in and they have preconceived notions and ideas of what sex should be like. And so if you're not on the same page in there, that's a cause for issues in your relationship. And then the same thing with money. the idea of money and how you how what your relationship is to money, and how your relationship with money growing up. How did your family do finances? How did they teach you about finances? What is your value around money, and how it's to be used, and what it's used for? And so again, and it all starts with communication because in a relationship, those are things that you have to be talking about constantly, to get all those things on the table before you decide to commit to this kind of long-term marital relationship.
Okay. Okay. And then give me the greatest benefits of having a loving relationship tethered to each other by a spiritual connection.
Yeah, I think it's about building legacy for generations to come. Especially in the African American Black community, when we talk about the legacy of our people, um, uh, starting here in 19, and the legacy of slavery, and the way in which that institution essentially dismantled the Black family and used Black men as breeders, and Black women as hosts for breeding, to then sell our Black bodies for profit. And so looking at that legacy and saying, even through all of that, Black love is still, Black love. There may be some there in every culture, in every people group, but in particular in African American people, there's some trauma that we have experienced in relationship because of that, and those are things that spill over into families and generations that never dealt with it, and it just gets passed on, and it begins to look like culture, when really it's not culture. It's traumatic response to historic stuff. And so when you're able to find that good spot, that spiritual connection, that longevity, and all of that, you begin to think of breaking these generational curses that came before you to build a legacy for the next generation and generations to come through your bloodline.
Excellent. And so, last question on this piece. Do you think that as we have progressed as a people in this country, that we have become more spiritual or less spiritual?
Well, I think that we've always been spiritual from before we got here. When we were on the continent of Africa, and different tribes and countries, was they were always spiritual. And so what we have today is what some theologians call African carryover. And so some of those spiritual practices are embedded in some of the Judeo-Christian experiences, and some of the Islamic, Muslim faith, and then some of the like today is some of the African spirituality, that people practice. And so I don't think it's a question of we become less spiritual. I think it's more of we've always been spiritual, and we've in the African diaspora is not a monolith, in that everybody worships the same way, sees God the same way, or views spirituality the same way. So some people's spirituality is not going inside of a brick and mortar building once a week to worship. Some people's spirituality is meditation and going and doing yoga. Some people's spirituality is out in nature and doing hikes and walks, and meditating and things like that. And so our spirituality as a people have not decreased. I think it's been the same. I do think that I think that there is this secularism that some may have been embracing, but for the most part, we're still spiritual people. There's a study that just dropped. I think last month or month before last, by this organization called Barna that does research on churches. And so they did this study that they hadn't done since 1997 on the Black church. and the results were that Black people are more spiritual. Black people believe the Bible more. Black people attend church more, and all of these was more than any other ethnic group in the nation. Yet the Black church is still not immune to decline, which says that this generation of millennials and Gen Zs are not interested in the institution of the church, but they still embrace their spirituality of a faith.
That's yeah. That's powerful. That's a powerful piece of information for us to look and understand what's going on in inside of the church. Because a lot of us know that you don't necessarily see as many young people um, as you used to see.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
That's right.
yeah, I mean that used to be, and then I want to ask you about this. That used to be like a huge uh, tool for us meeting in our community. You know,
Mm-hmm.
we would meet at block parties and social events,
Mm-hmm.
but we would meet in church.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah. Back in the day, church was the cultural center, if you will, of the Black community. They'll say there's a church, a church and liquor store on every corner. Well, the church being on every corner meant that there was a place for those in that community to go to have community meetings, to have worship service, to have food programs, reading, tutoring programs when schools weren't meeting the mark. And so it was a cultural center, and staple in the Black community. And you would know that, anybody in a Black household, somebody went to church. You knew that somebody, Big Mama went to church, Grandmama went to church, and Mama went to church. Even if you didn't go, you knew somebody that went to church. And then if you didn't go, then you were probably part of the, what do we call it? The CME or CAE or whatever, where you would just show up on Christmas, Mother's Day, and Easter, but you still knew and respected the church. Well, today it's a lot different. There's a bigger gulfing gap where you can go into a household now and nobody has had any interaction or engagement with the church. So you can now find households in the Black community that have no connection to a church affiliation or attendance, not even grandma at this point, because they're, grandmothers are younger, and they got disconnected and for whatever reason. And so it is a lot different now than it was, say, in my generation X. I think after that, it started to, again, that gap started to grow.
And how do you think that growing gap has impacted our ability to not only create loving relationships in our community, but also to sustain them?
Well, I think that people are using and running to, again, the more secular kind of solutions, the more media driven kind of influencers. And so instead of getting my understanding about human relationships and spirituality and marriage from a spiritual perspective, and so in my case from the Bible, then I get mine from the Red Table with Jada Pinkett. So now I think that my relationships, if I want to, have couples goals, hashtag couple goals, my couples goals is now, Will Smith or Jay-Z and Beyonce. So now I'm striving for something that is, one, unattainable, and two, unhealthy. But because it's media driven, it seems like it must be something I should strive after.